It started with a signal none of us were cleared to hear. The briefing was quiet, clinical, and empty of real answers. Just layers of "you don't need to know" stacked beneath standard protocol. By the time we landed at Vostok Station, the sky was already a pale bruise above the white, and the sun was low enough to remind you that daylight was a courtesy in Antarctica, not a guarantee. The plane didn't even cut its engines. We were offloaded in less than a minute, gear stacked on sleds, and already clipped into snow harnesses by the time the bird took off again. A whine fading into the sky and nothing more. The wind swallowed the sound like it had teeth. None of us spoke during the haul toward the ice tunnel. Captain Ellison led, rifle slung diagonally, boots punching through the crusted snow with sharp efficiency. Meacham took up the rear, checking gear and range every 100 paces. I kept my eyes forward, following Hernandez's trail markers like they were breadcrumbs. O'Malley walked beside me, silent, like always. We weren't here for a search and rescue. We weren't here for an exfil. We were here to secure an asset, the kind of word used when people don't want to name what's actually down there, the kind of word that comes with thicker files and locked briefcases. The tunnel entrance was nothing more than a rectangular hatch in the ice. No signage, no flag, no identifying codes. Just a steel airlock door welded into the glacier, slightly frosted at the edges, and cold enough that even with gloves on, your fingers could feel it through the insulation. The engineers who built the tunnel were long gone. We were told they were evacuated early due to supply issues, but that was a lie. Their equipment was still down there, frozen in place. Half-packed crates, idle drills, food wrappers left mid-meal. Nobody leaves that fast because they ran out of rations. Someone told them to get out. Fast. Once we were inside, the temperature barely changed. Ice absorbed light and noise both, and even though the overhead LEDs ran along the full length of the tunnel, casting clean white pools on the ground every 10 meters, it felt dim. Cold sank into the bones of the place, not just physical cold, something else, the kind that you couldn't shake with body heat. Like silence had a shape down here, like it was watching. The descent took most of the day. Nearly 9 hours on foot, interrupted only for water breaks and oxygen checks. The vertical shafts were cut with military precision, reinforced in sections with steel plates and expandable foam, while the deeper segments were carved straight into the ice using melt-boring rigs. Crampons kept our footing, and safety lines ran the full length of the tunnel, but even so, none of us felt steady. The air changed the farther down we went. Not just thinner, off, filtered differently, sometimes metallic, sometimes dry as bone. Our breath steamed inside the masks, but nothing ever felt warm. We stopped checking the temperature after it hit -60. That was 4 hours in. Eventually, we hit the plateau. The shaft opened into a wider cavern, the staging area if you believed the mission file. But this wasn't some geological alcove formed by thermal expansion. This place had angles. The ground wasn't rock. It was smooth, symmetrical tile. Not tile like linoleum. Tile like obsidian cut with surgical precision, fused to the floor and inset with long, subtle patterns that spiraled out from the center. No seams, no grout. It didn't reflect our lights either. It absorbed them. Our beams seemed thinner here, like the air was thicker, and it wasn't until Ellison stepped forward that anyone actually moved across the threshold. He told us to fan out and secure a 30-meter perimeter. I moved with O'Malley, tracing the edge of the cavern, checking for structural integrity and secondary passages. There were none, just the one way in. The silence pressed in tighter the farther you walked from the center, as if distance from the object created resistance. The object. That's what they called it. Not a ship, not a structure. The object, as if giving it a neutral label could neutralize what it was. It sat half embedded in a cradle of ice, hunched like a fossilized animal, organic in shape, but wrong in proportion. Not round, not boxy, curved, tapered, like a mollusk designed by someone who had never seen the ocean. The outer surface shimmered faintly under our lights, but didn't reflect. It pulsed faintly with blues and grays, as if responding to attention, though we wrote that off as refracted light. Some part of me wanted it to be just an illusion. But when Meacham stepped closer, his radio crackled with interference for the first time all day. "Something's still living there," he muttered low, not looking at anyone in particular. I didn't respond. Nobody did. The object had no visible entry, no vents, no cracks, but the top portion, just above what we assumed to be a central ridge, held something else. A translucent bulge, not glass, not ice. It didn't frost over. It held. And behind it, deep but unmistakable, was a shape, a silhouette, vaguely humanoid, curled, facing downward, limbs drawn in close, something preserved in stasis or decay or both. Ellison called it in. We waited for 30 minutes while he tried to raise command. The only answer was static, broken occasionally by half words, cut-off syllables, and what might have been our own transmission, bounced back in some kind of loop. O'Malley double-checked the comms dish. No damage, no reason for the failure. Just failure, like the environment rejected signal. During that time, Meacham tried testing the object's surface with a thermal pen. The numbers dropped immediately. Surface temp was recorded at -140 Celsius. That's lower than the ambient air around us. Something inside it was colder than the planet. We set up camp 100 meters away. No one wanted to pitch tents any closer. No need to say it. Even Ellison didn't argue. We used the emergency canvas dome and sealed it with pressure flaps. Heat didn't last long in a space like that, but it was enough to cycle the masks off for a few minutes at a time. We each took a corner. Hernandez started boiling what little clean water we had left using the portable heater. Meacham did an inventory count without being asked. I cleaned and reassembled my rifle, even though it hadn't been fired once. We all needed a task. O'Malley didn't sit. He stood near the flap with his back to us, watching the tunnel entrance. When I asked if he saw something, he didn't answer. His radio was off, but I could see the green light on the earpiece. He was listening to something. Nobody else's unit was broadcasting. We rotated sleep in 3-hour shifts. I took first watch, sat near the flap and kept my rifle across my knees, eyes on the path beyond the ice. Nothing moved, but something didn't feel right. The object itself wasn't visible from the tent. Not directly, but the cavern still hummed faintly in the distance, like a pressure differential you couldn't pinpoint, the kind you feel in your molars more than your ears. Sometime during O'Malley's shift, I woke without warning. Not to a sound, not to a light. Just woke. The tent was dim. The heater was off. The glow strips had flickered to emergency red. No one else stirred. I looked toward the flap. It was open. Only a crack, but open. I sat up, slow, not making a sound. O'Malley was gone. His harness was still there. His rifle, too. Boots missing. No note. No protocol breach signal on the tracker. Just absence. I didn't wake the others yet. I stepped outside. The air burned instantly, my eyelashes crusting with frost. I didn't see movement, but the object had changed. The translucent shell at the top was clearer now. Whatever had been inside had moved. I didn't move closer to the object right away. Every instinct told me not to. Not because I was scared, though I was, but because it felt wrong to approach something that had just changed on its own. The shell, or canopy, or whatever you wanted to call that curved top section of the craft, was no longer fogged over with frost. A thin layer of condensation had slid down its surface, as if the temperature had shifted just enough inside to melt the rime from within. The figure behind it, which had been hunched in a fetal position, was now visibly turned toward the ice wall. Not fully upright, not active, just rotated, as if it were aware of the air or the direction of noise, or maybe of me standing there outside the tent in the dark. I scanned the ice for boot prints, half expecting to see O'Malley's trail leading directly to the object. There was nothing, not even a depression. His steps hadn't disturbed the frost, which didn't make sense. I checked the exterior of the tent again to make sure I hadn't missed something. Scratches on the fabric, marks in the snow, anything at all that indicated movement. Still nothing. It was like he'd been lifted out of his boots and erased. I returned inside without turning my back to the chamber. Once I was in the tent, I latched the flap tightly, double-checked the external seal, and only then woke Captain Ellison. I didn't want to alarm the others too quickly, but I had to report what I'd seen. He didn't blink when I told him O'Malley was missing. He just stood up, pulled on his outer thermal layer, and quietly roused Meacham and Hernandez. Everyone dressed in full kit before we stepped outside again. We swept the area in a three-point formation with Ellison in the lead. Still no tracks, no visual, no movement. We circled the object, sticking to a 50-foot radius at Ellison's instruction. As we reached the back quadrant, where the ice wall curved into the chamber's far edge, we found something half buried. Not clothing, not a weapon, a glove, thick, our standard issue, frozen rigid and upright, as if someone had stuck it in a snowbank fingers first. No blood, no signs of tearing, no arm attached. Ellison examined it, turned it over, and handed it to Meacham without a word. Inside the wrist lining was a tag, O'Malley. We returned to camp in silence and powered up the emergency comm rig, which we'd packed as backup in case the internal lines failed completely. No signal, not even a pulse. The feedback meter didn't register a single bounce. Meacham tested the antenna array, adjusted the angle, and even spooled out a second receiver to ensure we weren't blocked by interference. Still nothing. Hernandez rerouted through the portable sat link we were never supposed to use unless extraction was imminent. That got us a pulse, but no uplink. The system blinked once, green, and then died completely. It was Meacham who said what the rest of us were thinking. Something's cutting it off, not jamming it, killing it. We're not being blocked. We're being absorbed. He looked at the object when he said it, not at us. I didn't like how certain he sounded, like he knew more than he'd let on since we got here. Ellison didn't press him. He just nodded once and told us to rotate watches again and conserve all remaining rations. No one spoke after that. I tried to sleep during second watch, but couldn't. The air inside the dome felt off, drier than before. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth even with water. I sat up eventually and just watched the fabric of the tent ripple ever so slightly, as if the pressure outside was shifting. Like the weight of the ice above us was rising and falling by inches without sound. The lights inside the dome dimmed twice during that stretch, though our internal batteries were reading full. I didn't mention it to the others. Not yet. When morning came, if you could call it that under a mile of ice, we packed down the camp and prepared to move closer to the object. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to determine whether O'Malley was inside or whether there was a breach in the chamber we'd missed. The closer we got, the more unstable our gear readings became. The temperature dropped steadily within a 20-foot radius. The light became warped. Not dimmer, refracted. Our shadows didn't line up correctly. Ellison walked beside me, but his shadow was slightly ahead of mine, tilted at a wrong angle. I didn't say anything. I could tell by the tightening of his jaw that he noticed too. We circled the object a second time, this time closer, studying the surface in detail. It was not metal, not in the conventional sense. It had the sheen of brushed alloy, but when Meacham touched it with the magnetic scanner, the needle didn't move. It wasn't ferrous. It didn't register as any material the scanner recognized at all. He tried the density probe next. No reading. It was like the probe couldn't find the surface, as if the object was perpetually 1 millimeter farther than expected. Ellison told him to mark the scan as failed and move on. That's when the shell cracked. It wasn't a loud sound, more like a faint hiss. A thin fracture line appeared in the translucent dome, spiderwebbing across the front before slowly curling downward like ice melting in slow motion. No pressure release, no gas, no alarm. But we all stepped back immediately and leveled our weapons. The figure inside remained motionless, still curled slightly inward, but now visible in disturbing clarity. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. The proportions were deceptive at first glance. 4 limbs, head-like structure, but the limbs were too long. The angles of the joints were subtly wrong. Fingers too narrow. No visible mouth. Skin, if you could call it that, was a dull, almost translucent gray, like ash packed into thin rubber. It had no eyes, but what looked like empty sockets surrounded by a faint corona of layered ridges that seemed to shift when the light moved across them. Meacham whispered something, and Ellison ordered him quiet without looking. None of us moved for several minutes. Nothing inside moved either. The cracks stopped spreading. The dome remained intact. Eventually, Ellison ordered us to pull back and regroup at the far side of the chamber. We carried what gear we could and re-established a temporary station near the original drilling rig. That's when we found the second glove. This one wasn't O'Malley's. It was untagged, older, and stiff with ice. Inside the glove was a broken penlight, long dead, and a patch from a private contractor no one recognized. Hernandez scanned the badge with our archive tablet. It wasn't in any of the records. Someone else had been here before us. That fact changed everything. It meant the engineers didn't leave because of frostbite or comms failure. They left because something had already happened. Something they weren't allowed to report. Something that was buried in enough silence that even Ellison's authority couldn't access it. Meacham went pale and asked to retrieve one of the abandoned data logs near the rig support frame. Ellison nodded once. Meacham didn't come back. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. We tried to raise him over the short range, but it was nothing but static. Hernandez and I advanced toward the frame together with lights on full beam. His trail was clear at first. Then it wasn't. A single line of footprints led in. Nothing led out. His last footprint stopped 5 meters from the data log. Then nothing, as if he'd sunk into the ground or been plucked upward by something not bound by the same gravity we understood. Hernandez backed away quickly. I didn't blame him. I retrieved the data log myself. It was still functional, powered by a cracked solar cell that had just enough charge left to boot one file, a video log. We watched it together back at the camp. The footage showed 4 men in light blue parkas standing around the object, looking uncertain. One of them, maybe the project lead, touched the shell with his ungloved hand and smiled, as if it responded to him. Then he collapsed. Not dropped. Collapsed. Crumpled. The others screamed. The feed cut out. No timestamps, no audio. Just 15 seconds of confusion and an ending no one wrote down. Ellison didn't say a word after that. He ordered the camp lights off, the tent half disassembled, and moved us back into the melt tunnel for shelter. We didn't argue. The object loomed in the distance behind us as we walked, faintly pulsing now. Faint bands of gray and green barely visible in the air around it, like heat distortion in reverse. As we reached the halfway point of the tunnel, I looked back over my shoulder once. Not because I heard something, but because I could feel the shift. The shell was now fully clear, and the figure inside had opened its eyes. There's something about eye contact that bypasses every rational system in the body. You don't have to understand what you're looking at. You don't even need proof that it's conscious. The moment the figure in that pod, whatever species, machine, or stage of life it represented, opened its eyes, I felt something pull at my attention, like a tension wire jerked tight across my skull. I blinked, stepped behind Hernandez as if for cover, and tried not to acknowledge that I'd seen what I had seen. We didn't speak as we set up inside the tunnel. Ellison picked a segment 30 meters into the descent path where we had a slight overhang from the melting rig's cuts into the upper layers of ice. It wasn't exactly safe, but it was enclosed on 3 sides and narrow enough to defend if it came to that. We packed snow into the lower crevices to seal out airflow and draped the thermal tarp to hold what little heat the gear gave us. The lights were dimmed to preserve battery. We rotated into another silent watch cycle, 3 hours on, 3 off. No one slept. Hernandez sat against the far wall, his pack cradled in his lap, staring at the tunnel mouth as if expecting Meacham to return with a casual shrug and some nonsense about getting lost in the dark. Ellison remained upright, kneeling with his weapon pointed downward but not relaxed. I don't think he blinked for half an hour. I kept my gloves on and my mask within arm's reach, just in case. I knew it wasn't protocol, but we were well past protocols now. We were improvising in the dark, guided by nothing but instinct and dread. During second watch, I heard something strange. Not a voice, not a machine. A hum, rhythmic, very faint. I moved closer to the tunnel mouth to listen. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't coming from our comms gear or from the cold crackle of the wind outside. It was pulsing in even intervals, a low tone that vibrated slightly in the joints of my jaw more than in my ears. I checked the gear. Nothing showed on the meters, no power draw, no signal wave, just the steady beat of something like sonar in reverse, calling inward, not out. By the time the others noticed it, the pulse had deepened. Still soft, still spaced like a metronome, but lower now, denser. It made conversation difficult, even when we raised our voices slightly. Ellison ordered us to shut down all unnecessary electronics to reduce interference. It didn't help. The sound didn't care about wires. It was in the ice itself. The tunnel acted like a resonance chamber, amplifying the vibrations into the walls around us. I pressed my palm against the ice. It was warm, not a trick of nerves. Warm, as if the glacier itself was losing mass. Hernandez finally broke the silence. "It's not just a ship," he said. "It's not just housing something. It is something." He said it with a kind of calm that felt entirely out of place, not detached, resigned, like someone reading a fact out loud after trying not to admit it to himself. I didn't respond. Neither did Ellison. We didn't know what to do with that kind of statement. There was no playbook for this. No clear enemy, no visible threat. Just a hum in the dark and the knowledge that 2 of our team were gone. That was when the light in the tunnel changed. Not flickered, changed. It dimmed gradually, not from the loss of power, but from an environmental shift. The LED glow sticks still shone at full output, but they no longer illuminated more than a few feet. The ice walls started refracting differently, bending the light into strange halos that made it impossible to judge distance. Ellison switched on his headlamp and aimed it down the tunnel. The beam disappeared 10 meters out. Just vanished. Like the air had thickened into fog, but no moisture was visible. We packed everything we could carry, left behind anything non-essential, and moved quietly back toward the main chamber. We weren't going to hold out in the tunnel with visibility like that. Not with the pressure shifting and the walls subtly vibrating like the glacier was breathing. It took us longer than it should have. What should have been a 5-minute walk became 15. The GPS units stopped tracking. Hernandez counted steps aloud, but his cadence began to drift. We reached the chamber not by distance, but by sound. The hum was stronger there. So strong it made your vision swim slightly at the edges if you stared at anything too long. The object was different again. Not larger, not repositioned, but awake. The pulsing wasn't coming from the structure. It was coming from inside the shell. The figure within it was now sitting fully upright, arms drawn in but not tense. Its head tilted forward as if observing us, though it had no visible eyes. The sockets were darker now. The ridges around its upper skull had changed orientation, aligning into a faint radial pattern that hadn't been there before. We couldn't prove it was movement, but all three of us agreed. It was watching us. Hernandez stepped backward and lowered his gear. He muttered something I didn't catch, and I moved closer to hear him. Then I saw it. His boots were half melted at the soles, not from heat. There wasn't enough warmth to explain it. The tread was softened, like it had been worn down by friction. But we hadn't traveled enough distance for that. Not even close. He didn't notice. He kept walking. Then he tripped. No warning. And when he landed, he didn't try to stand back up. Just lay there, staring at the object. We rushed to him. Ellison reached first and pulled him upright. I scanned for injury, bleeding, gear failure. Nothing. Hernandez just looked at both of us and said, "It showed me something." His voice was flat, like someone waking from a dream and reciting what he saw without understanding. We pressed him for details, but he didn't answer. Just repeated it once. "It showed me something." After that, he didn't speak again for the rest of the day. We moved camp to the outer edge of the chamber, as far from the object as possible. The hum never stopped. It resonated through our bones and altered the rhythm of our breathing. Not enough to be painful, just enough to keep us off balance. Ellison attempted one last connection to HQ. He recorded a brief summary, time-stamped our coordinates, and embedded it in the emergency ping. We watched the light turn green, flash once, and then fade. Nothing left. No confirmation, no return signal. The system bricked. Sometime that evening, or what we guessed was evening, Hernandez walked away. No gear, no warning. Just stood up and walked directly toward the object. Ellison yelled once, but he didn't stop. He stepped through the ring of frost surrounding the base and disappeared into the glow. Not vanished, not disintegrated. Just stepped through. The dome shimmered faintly in response, not like it was opening, more like it had been expecting him. We waited. An hour, then 2, then 3. He never came back. Ellison didn't say anything. He just sat down on a gear crate and put his head in his hands. I hadn't seen him do that before. Not once. He'd been the solid one, the constant. and now he was silent. Not from panic, from loss, from the realization that everything we'd trained for meant nothing down here. I spent the next several hours cataloging what remained: 2 rifles, limited ammo, 1 half-drained medkit, backup rations, and half a tank of potable water. I did it quietly, more for my own sense of control than anything else. Ellison eventually stood again and walked to the object, keeping just outside the frost ring. He stared at it for a long time. Then he turned to me and said, "We're not getting out, are we?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to say we'd find another tunnel, or that comms would come back, but I didn't. I just nodded. That night, the hum stopped. Not gradually, not in phases. It ended like a switch had been thrown. No fading, no echo. Just silence. Complete. Crushing. My ears rang from the sudden absence. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the dark and watched the object. The dome was clear again. The figure was no longer inside. There was no breach, no crack, no hatch, but it was gone. The interior was empty. Ellison and I scouted the area in a tight formation, lights on full. We circled the chamber 3 times, checked the tunnel entrance, rechecked our own gear, and scanned for footprints. There were none. The snow hadn't shifted. The temperature hadn't changed. The dome was sealed, but the entity, whatever had been encased in that structure, was no longer there. And the air now smelled faintly of salt. Ellison and I stood at the edge of the frost ring for a long time after we confirmed the pod was empty. The silence that replaced the low-frequency hum had weight to it. It wasn't relief. It wasn't calm. It was the kind of quiet you get before the pressure changes, before a blast wave or a seismic shift. And even though the figure inside the dome was gone, there was no sense of escape. If anything, the absence made it worse. At least when it was inside the pod, we knew where it was. Now it could be anywhere in the chamber, or worse, anywhere beyond it. We double-checked our gear. Neither of us said the word weapons, but both of us made sure our rifles were clean and chambered. Ammo was still low. We hadn't used a single round since we landed, but the math didn't lie. A few stray rounds had been cracked or swollen by the extreme cold, and we'd lost another box in the initial descent when Meacham's pack had slipped into a melt fissure. That left us with less than 2 full mags each, and no idea what we'd be firing at. I suggested we check the melt tunnel again to look for Hernandez. Ellison didn't answer right away. He just stared at the object, then finally nodded once. We moved with discipline, weapons up, headlamps on full spread, scanning the ice for shadows or movement. The tunnel was even darker than before, as if the light didn't reflect correctly anymore. I angled my beam down and saw that the ice along the floor had changed. It was wet. Not slick or slushy like from environmental shift, but damp with a faint sheen that made no physical sense. Temperatures were still below -70. That kind of surface doesn't melt, not without heat. We found footprints. At first I thought they were Hernandez's, but the spacing was off, too wide. The impressions were long, narrow, and without tread. Not boots, bare feet, if you could call them that. The toes were too long, and there were no signs of skin drag or pressure points. Just perfectly placed indentations every few feet, leading up the tunnel wall and vanishing into the ceiling rock. Ellison muttered something under his breath and raised his rifle. I didn't ask what he saw. I already knew. We turned back. When we returned to the chamber, the object had changed again. Not in shape, but in presence. It was dimmer now, but not visually. You could feel it, like it had collapsed slightly inward, like its purpose had concluded. The shell was still clear, still intact, but now it looked more like a dead husk than a dormant structure. Whatever it had held was gone. Whatever it had been doing was finished. That was when we heard the sound. Not loud, not aggressive, just footsteps. Not running, not scraping, walking, deliberate. Ellison signaled silently, dropped into a crouch and moved toward the far edge of the chamber with slow, precise steps. I mirrored him. The sound came from the secondary tunnel, the one we hadn't used since arrival, carved by a scout drone during the initial survey phase. It wasn't supposed to be viable, just a sonar echo that formed a shallow shelf before collapsing in on itself. But something was coming from that direction now. We held position behind one of the outcroppings left by a drilling rig, breath slow and shallow, listening as the steps came closer. Then they stopped. Nothing followed. No light. No sound. Ellison motioned me left while he moved right. We flanked the tunnel entrance and waited. Nothing. After a full minute, he stepped forward and aimed his beam inside. The light caught the edge of something wet, dragging along the ice, then gone. No turn, no retreat. It vanished like it had slipped through the glacier itself. We scanned with infrared. Nothing, no heat, no trace. Ellison didn't speak. We backed out and returned to the pod. That's when we saw it, etched beside the frost ring, burned into the ice. Thin, curling symbols formed coordinates. Ellison recognized them immediately. Longitude, latitude, depth. He jotted them in his journal, didn't explain, and didn't need to. The message was clear. This site wasn't the only one. We left without ceremony, packed what gear still worked, sealed our suits, and began the climb. We weren't hopeful. We just refused to wait for something we couldn't understand to make the next move. The tunnels had changed. Walls curved in unnatural ways. Our steps echoed strangely, sometimes once, sometimes twice. Ellison's tank started to leak a few hours in. He patched it with ice. It bought time. Not much. The farther we climbed, the dimmer our lights became. Not from failing power, but from the ice itself refusing to reflect. When Ellison said he heard something whisper his name, I didn't argue. We just kept moving. 9 hours in, we reached the first airlock, partially collapsed. We melted it open with most of our emergency flares. Thin air greeted us, barely breathable, but enough. The last tunnel nearly broke us, 100 meters through brittle silence. Ellison faltered. I got him up. He still clutched the notebook, repeating the coordinates like they were the only thing keeping him anchored. When we breached the surface, it didn't feel like escape, just survival. The wind was sharp but honest. We collapsed beside an old tractor buried in frost. I fired a flare. No one saw it, but we were still alive. 2 days later, the rescue team found us. I was conscious. Ellison wasn't. He hadn't spoken since we surfaced. Still breathes, doesn't wake, just holds on like a machine waiting for a command that never comes. My report was buried under red tape. They rewrote everything, called it a seismic anomaly, a geological artifact. I was discharged and told to forget it, but I kept the coordinates. Yesterday, I checked them. Satellite scans show a void deep under another ice shelf. No history, no expeditions, just blank white on the map. But the shape matches the pod, and it's larger,